when I actually saw it, bear in mind, this was my first step into property. Turned up to Liverpool, and I turn up to literally an abandoned building with nothing in it. And these estate agents, they're really good at these sales agents will sell you the dream. They're like, listen, we're going to put this there, and it's going to be this and that, and there's going to be a lift here, and it's going to have a fireplace. And you've got to buy into the vision, because what you're seeing in front of you is nothing, just bricks, mortar, floorboards.
Hello, what's going on, people? Welcome back to my channel. Hope you're doing good. This week I managed to sit down with Warren Gosling, who is a property investor and YouTuber, and we managed to sit down and talk about his personal journey into property, some of the challenges which he faced along the way, and some of the strategies which he's currently implementing to achieve his future goals. Now, Warren is a super cool guy. He has a wealth of experience around property and has a background within finance. So that's why I was really excited to sit down with him and pick his brains and get as much advice as I could to help me on my personal journey into property. So let's get straight into the interview. Hope you enjoy it. Warren, how you doing?
I'm good, Jamie. It's good to see you. How are you doing?
Yeah, well, good, really good, thank you. Good to finally sit down and speak to you about some of the stuff that you've got going on at the minute.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been looking forward to it too. So it's good to be here.
I've been following kind of your YouTube for a while now, and you were kind of one of the guys on YouTube which kind of inspired me to kind of get into property and get into investing and actually start my YouTube. So really excited to talk to you today, mainly about property. And that's going to be the focus of today's kind of conversation around kind of your journey into property, what you're currently doing, and kind of your ambitions for the future, and getting as much knowledge as I can to kind of help me on to my journey into property.
Shoot, no problem. Let's do this.
Nice one. So obviously I know who you are, but obviously people watching this video might not know who Warren Gosling is. So do you want to firstly kick off with a little bit about yourself, your background, kind of your day-to-day job?
Yeah, no, sure, Jamie. So yeah, I guess you've introduced me well. So my name is Warren Gosling, and in terms of YouTube, I'm on there by the same name. So if you want to have a look at my content, it's Warren Gosling, and mainly speaking about property as we're talking about today. Also a bit around investing in the stock market, mainly via funds. But I guess my main passion is property, as we'll come on to later on. But yeah, in terms of background, I work in finance, so I work in banking, have done since I graduated all the way back in 2008, which seems like an age ago now. But yeah, that's pretty much been my career, working in credit risk, which is basically when the bank extends loans to customers and finance products to customers, managing how the bank gets repaid, and managing that relationship with a client from a financial aspect. And then also operational risk, which is sort of how the bank operates, like people, processes, and systems. So that's my background inside of work, and that's what I do outside of work with regard to the YouTube and investing.
Thank you for sharing your background. Let's dive into kind of your property portfolio. So I think you mentioned that you started your portfolio around 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, so I bought my first property, I'm trying to think back here, I think it was 2017. So that was a property in Liverpool, and I've purposely gone outside of London, mainly from an affordability aspect, because the average price of a one bed in London is, as you all know, is like 300k upwards. It's crazy. Whereas outside of London, when you go, the further up north you go, the cheaper it becomes, and the yields are actually better as well. So that was my first property that I bought on my journey. And I guess like prior to that, I did quite a lot of learning and education, because I think getting into property, it's one of those industries or one of those areas where unless you kind of know somebody that's already in investing, or you have, say, like a family member, or you've got connections within like the industry, if you're just starting out cold, it's very intimidating. So and it's important to know what you're doing. It's not something you can really do off the fly because there's so much money at stake. So maybe we'll come on to it later on in this interview, but yeah, education and just upping your knowledge in terms of how it works and the process, what you need to go through and the boxes to tick is like very important. So that was kind of my personal journey into property.
So you mentioned that you are investing outside of London, purely because of the inflated house prices in the capital. How are you managing these properties? Do you let them out to an estate agent to kind of manage on a day-to-day basis, or are you still kind of managing that from your home in London?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So it's kind of like a hybrid. So I use an estate agent or a letting agent, probably more accurate, to find tenants, because when you own a property, and you all know, anyone who's ever lived in a house, right, whether you own or not, but most of us have been in a position at some point where we've been renting a property. When you're looking, you do viewings. So you pick a property in X area of X city or town, then you turn up, an estate agent or the owner will show you around, see whether you like the property or not, and if you do, you put forward an offer. So with me being in London and my properties being in Liverpool and Sheffield, I can't do viewings. So that's really where I get the value from the letting agent. They handle all that for me. They do the viewings, and also they vet the tenant, which is very important because I've been burned off of that in one particular instance. But yeah, the vetting in terms of making sure that they earn a certain income and they're able to pay the rent and they have a job, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I use the estate agent for: the viewing, the vetting, and the money collection each month. In terms of day-to-day management, so anything from like busted pipes, the radiators aren't working, et cetera, that's my job. The beautiful thing is, though, because they're flats inside of developments, nowadays with a lot of flats inside of developments, they have what you call facilities managers. So when you're paying a service charge, you pay a service charge to the block manager, and all of the stuff inside of the flat, 9 times out of 10 will be handled by the block manager. So I mentioned towel rails not working, those kind of instances, the block manager will handle those for you. And if they don't, there have been instances where the block manager doesn't handle it for me. So there was one where a shower wasn't working and it broke down. I got onto ratemybuilder.com and I found a tradesman on there and just handled that through 5 or 6 texts, gave him the address, just coordinated when he was to show up, when the actual tenant would be in, and presto, it was done. Just transferred him the money. So it's not actually a lot of work. I mean, if I had to total it up over a month to month basis in terms of managing the properties, I'd probably spend a day at the very most managing bits and bobs to do with the flats.
And I guess that stems from having good tenants as well in the property, looking after it. So having the estate agent obviously vetting them and taking that process at the start is beneficial as well, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's all sorts of nightmare stories of tenants. They're wild, I don't know if you're if you're part of any property forums, but there's a really good one called Property Tribes, really good forum, and also the Property Hub. And with a forum, it's basically a message board, and it's got thousands of other landlords, property owners, estate agents, all sorts of people around property in them. And if you're ever unsure about anything, it doesn't matter how trivial or how complex it is, you pop it in there and people really do go out their way to help you. But that's kind of a side thing. But if anyone's looking to get into property, definitely join one of those forums, very helpful. But yeah, just some of the stories you hear with like bad tenants that haven't been vetted properly up front, that's going to save you a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort further down the line just by doing that properly.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, and I'll definitely look into kind of those forums. It would be interesting to see what kind of conversations are going on there, and good networking as well, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just diving into your purchasing your first property as kind of a newbie to the property world. What was the kind of biggest obstacles that you faced purchasing that first property?
Yeah, I think so. With that particular property in Liverpool, the first one, it was an off-plan property. So it was a really tired Victorian, Edwardian, one of the two. I can't really tell periods. I'm not, but it was old, yeah. And it had been derelict for some time. So what they were doing was that they were literally gutting the whole thing out, like shell,
Yeah.
and then rebuilding it from the core outwards. So when I actually saw it, bear in mind, this was my first step into property, and I was looking like cities, and landed on Liverpool through research, and doing my research on like on what do you call it, Rightmove. Didn't find well, I did find a couple on there that I actually liked, but long story short, when I got in contact with the actual estate agent on the property that I did find that I liked on Rightmove, it was those aren't available, but we have this other option. So turned up to Liverpool, and I turn up to literally an abandoned building with nothing in it. And these estate agents, they're really good at just, these sales agents will sell you the dream. They're like, listen, we're going to put this there, and it's going to be this and that, and there's going to be a lift here, and it's going to have a fireplace. And you've got to buy into the vision, because what you're seeing in front of you is nothing, just bricks, mortar, floorboards, blah blah blah. So anyway, yeah, it was a development. It was a project that wasn't going to be built for another 9 months. And again, I wasn't familiar with the process, so it was like, okay, so you pay your deposit now, and we exchange. It was about 6 months in the future, and then after we've exchanged, 3 months after that we complete, and then your property will be built. So I'm like, I'm going to pay thousands of pounds now to secure it as a deposit. Well, secure it as a deposit. Then I'm going to exchange 6 months later, and it's still not going to be built. And then I'm going to pay all the balance on. So really, you're putting yourself in their hands. You have to. There's a lot of trust involved when it comes to off-plan development. So just to bring it back to your point, in terms of the biggest obstacle, it was just not understanding the process, and there was a lot of fear and nervousness there, because I was like, well, what if they don't build it? What do I what do I do? And it can be very scary. It's a very scary process. However, now having gone through it, a couple of times now, it's normal. If that's the particular strategy you want to use, because obviously you can buy properties that are already built and are standing fine. There's no uncertainty there. But you can also choose properties that are going to be effectively new builds and be built in the future. So I'd say that was my biggest challenge, and I don't know if I'd recommend it as a first purchase for a newbie, but it was a very interesting experience.
So is that a key strategy for you to kind of invest in new build off-plan developments, or do you kind of invest in already built properties as well?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't know if it's like an intentional strategy, but the three that I own, well, I own two. The first one, as I said, was off plan. The second one was just built a couple of years ago. So it was there. There was no like waiting period for it to be built. This third one that I'm buying now, it's going to complete in March. But again, don't know about that because of lockdown, part three. And builders and that, it might be delayed. But yeah, I've kind of ended up purchasing new builds, two of which have been off plan. I think the benefit with new builds is that, generally speaking, there's less issues with them because they're new. So you're unlikely to encounter any, serious kind of structural or even like cosmetic issues within the flat because everything's new. So I would say that that's probably an intentional strategy to target relatively new builds. Not so much off plan, but it's just happened that way,
And I guess that helps with you kind of being in London, away from kind of where your property is,
100%.
The peace of mind that the property is new, and there's not going to be a lot of things to fix on a kind of day-to-day basis with the tenant in there.
Yeah. Not a lot of stress, and that's where I like to keep it,
Yeah. You spoke a little bit about your strategy in terms of intentionally or unintentionally kind of focusing on new build off-plan developments, but are you kind of focused on the simple kind of buy-to-let strategy, or are you kind of more focused on kind of serviced accommodation?
Yeah, so my flat in Sheffield is straightforward vanilla buy-to-let. The Liverpool one that I bought, the first one that I bought that we talked about earlier, when they were building that, the intention of the developers was to build them and then let them all out as serviced accommodation units. So what that meant for me was, as a landlord, when the individual who's going to be using my flat as serviced accommodation, takes it under their management effectively, they're going to be paying me a guaranteed rent. So whether it's occupied or not, I get my rent every month. So that was what happened with that Liverpool one. Interestingly, it was about just under a year. So we're talking about 9-10 months after the property was built, so the freeholder actually changed, and the freeholder is the person you pay the ground rent to, and the freeholder basically said to all of the owners of the flats in the units, including myself, all of the units in the development, including myself, we're no longer going to permit these flats to be used for serviced accommodation. So you need to just switch them all to standard buy-to-let normal tenancy agreements. So after 10 months, I effectively lost that guaranteed rent that was coming in from the individual who's using my flat for serviced accommodation, and I had to switch it over to just a regular buy-to-let flat. So that was a Liverpool one. And then lastly, I mentioned at the beginning that there's a flat that I'm about to complete on, hopefully in March of this year in Liverpool. Same situation as the other Liverpool one. They're going to build 90 plus flats, and they're going to use them all for serviced accommodation. So the rent on those is going to be a lot higher. Income is going to be a lot higher than it would be on a normal buy-to-let. So that was one of the things that attracted me to it quite heavily in the first place. So in summary, 2 are normal buy-to-lets and 1 is going to be serviced accommodation.
So you've got 3 properties in your portfolio, or
Yeah.
soon to be 3. And you kind of recently released a video around kind of your experience in 2020.
Yeah.
Guys, 2020 has been a mad, absolute nightmare year for me in property. There's no real other way to put it.
Can you just kind of talk us through briefly, because I know it's quite detailed, what happened and some of the challenges that you experienced during that kind of difficult period during the pandemic?
Yeah, what didn't happen? Yeah, I guess in summary, with the Sheffield property, that was pretty straightforward. Because of what was going on with Brexit as well as Corona, I lost my tenant there. It was actually a Belgian chap. So he went back to Belgium. He decided that was best for him. So because of the lockdown that was going on at that period in time, he left, and it was just very hard to find another tenant. So that one was void for, I think, about 4 or 5 months. So I had to basically foot the bill for the mortgage payments for 4 or 5 months, and I wasn't getting any income. Luckily, because it's up north and it's £100,000 flat, the mortgage is a few £100s per month. So I make a really concerted effort. I make it intentionally keep a nest egg just for unlikely occurrences like that. So I had a reserve amount of funds to pay for that. So that was Sheffield. I think the most drama really came with the Liverpool one. So I mentioned to you that I had initially a guy that was using the flat for serviced accommodation. Long story short, when he left, so the freeholder said no more serviced accommodation. What we didn't know was that there was just all sorts of damage to the property, and also he hadn't paid his last month's rent. So all in all, the cost of all that was £1,200. We had a deposit that we took of £825, but that still left a shortfall of £400. And we complained to the council, to a few governing bodies within property, and long story short, what they said was, you'd have to take him to court because you've collected the deposit, but we cannot. They didn't have any mechanisms to force him to pay back that remaining £400. And they said you could take him to court, but it's going to cost you probably thousands of pounds to take a person to court. So by the time you're taking him to court, just to get £400 back,
Worth it?
Not worth it. So that was that with the serviced accommodation unit that I had in Liverpool. And then lastly, I was trying to buy. So I mentioned that I'm buying a Liverpool one that's going to complete in March, hopefully. There was a whole process to that. So I went to Doncaster, to Liverpool, to Swindon, and eventually landed in Liverpool. But long story short, I put in offers on a property in Doncaster, also in Nottingham, and they both fell through because of what was happening with the coronavirus and the economy in general. A lot of valuers were actually undervaluing properties. So I'd put in an offer, have it agreed, and then the next stage would be to get the mortgage, signed up and sorted. However, when the valuers came in to sort of validate the offer and validate the mortgage, they were valuing it below what the offer was. So the mortgage company came back and said, well, yeah, you put in an offer at, call it 100K, but the valuer says it's worth 75K. So we're only going to lend you 75K and you've got to come up with an extra 25K yourself. And that happened twice. And in terms of the length of time, it wasted about 6 months of last year going through that process over and over again. So it was long, but I learned a hell of a lot from it. So from that perspective, it's kind of invaluable experience, but at the time, bloody frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of headaches and sleepless nights, especially with obviously tenants leaving. But good that you had kind of a reserve fund as well, just in case anything happens like that. Cool. So looking forward to the future, what are your kind of plans and goals? Do you have a target number of properties which you want to kind of have in your portfolio? Do you have a specific value that you want your portfolio to achieve? What's your goals and ambitions for the future?
Yeah, I think in terms of my goals, my goal is to replace my income from work with income from property. So to do that and to do it as quickly as possible, and which I'd rather do, it'll be hard to achieve that number by doing just vanilla buy-to-lets. So I think after this one in Liverpool, I think the next 2 or 3, which I think should be able to achieve that, I'm going to aim for a mixture of serviced accommodation, but also commercial property units. So commercial property, I'm going to specifically target mixed use property. And those are, when you go down to your off license on a corner, to buy your milk or your crisps, whatever, you'll always notice that 9 times out of 10, there's usually a unit above it. So a flat above it. And that's mixed use property. So you have a commercial tenant, i.e. the shop owner, paying you a good commercial rent, but also you have a residential tenant above that. And it's quite a niche area of property that not a lot of people really talk about, but it's very lucrative and very liable. And the great thing about mixed use commercial property is that usually those commercial tenants usually sign up to 10, 15-year leases. So with a normal residential tenant, it's 12 months. But with a commercial property tenant, that's 10 years of pretty much guaranteed income. So that's the strategy I'm going to use. And in terms of my goal, I want to come out of work full time and really just live from property income.
What was the most surprising thing that you encountered on your journey, which you wasn't prepared for?
I think just the options that you have available with property. I mean, when I first came into it, my understanding was, based on the research that I'd done, is that, okay, with property, you can do buy to let and that's it, you get rent from a tenant and property goes up in value and that's how you make money. But it's just so much more broader than that, because we mentioned serviced accommodation that you can do to sort of like travelers or, short-term traveling tenants. You can do HMOs, housing of multiple occupation. You can do flipping. You can do, buy, refurb and refinance strategy. You can do commercial units. There's so many different strategies you can pick, and they give you different levels of income. You can even do rent to rent, and that's another strategy where you don't necessarily buy the property, but you gain management or control over the management of the property and make income that way. So, there's a myriad of different options with property. And I didn't really know that. And that was probably the most surprising thing. It's almost like the gift that keeps on giving,
Yeah, definitely. I'm still learning kind of the different strategies there are available in kind of property, and I think we'll come on to it in a minute around the kind of rent to rent, because I know that you're involved in it with service accommodation. But for kind of a beginner getting into property, is there a specific strategy which you would kind of advise to get into first, just to get that experience of kind of buying a property, managing tenants, managing letting agencies? Because kind of some of the more complex strategies like your HMOs, for example, could be quite overwhelming for a beginner. So is there a specific strategy which you would advise for that beginner?
I think it's a tough one, because I think like the industry, generally speaking, will tell you, stick with normal buy-to-let, vanilla buy-to-let first, kind of tiptoe into it. And then once you've done that for a while, go into more complex strategies. I kind of agree and disagree with that. I do think in principle that is very good advice and it makes perfect sense. It's hard to argue with that. But I don't see any reason why someone can't do serviced accommodation or HMO with the right education and training. So I would say, absolutely go for buy-to-let, normal buy-to-lets, but I think serviced accommodation is definitely possible for somebody who's just starting. But as I said, speak to somebody who's already doing it, like have somebody like a mentor or a contact. It doesn't have to be like a formal mentor. I know we use that word a lot, but just somebody that's doing it. And you don't even have to, know them that well. I mentioned Property Tribes. There are so many people that I've met just through going on that forum whose number I've kept. And I just said to them, like, do you mind if I stay in contact with you, like over the next couple of, months? I might text you like once every couple of months to shoot you some questions, because I know you've been doing this for longer than I have. And people love it when you actually ask them for advice. People, I find anyway, especially in property, people like to feel like they're giving you game and they're teaching you. And, you just flatter their ego a bit. It's just, oh, thanks, that's great information. Oh, you're amazing. And you're just getting free knowledge, So
now you said that, I won't stop texting you and DMing you for advice.
There you go, mate. Yeah, just stroke the ego. It's fine. But yeah, I think to answer your question, I think most of those strategies are achievable. But yeah, just get somebody to advise you and just get some education under your belt, and then you should be okay.
So that was part one of my interview with Warren Gosling. Really, really interesting. Some great insights, and some key take-home points for me is just around that piece around education. So education doesn't stop. Continually to learn new things, learn new strategies, whether that's buy-to-let, HMO, BRRR, for example. And even once you get on that property ladder as an investor, being a landlord is just a whole new ball game, and a whole new kind of topic of information which you can absorb as an investor. So really take home that point around education. And also I thought it was really interesting that Warren manages his properties from a distance. So his properties are located up north in Sheffield and Liverpool. And that initial process of vetting the tenants, getting them into the property, is managed locally by a letting agency. But all the day-to-day kind of management of that property, once the rooms are tenanted, he obviously manages from his home in London, which I think is really interesting. It obviously saves a bit of your money, a bit of your income coming in, it's going into your pocket and not into the letting agency. But the fact that he has confidence in his properties, they're new builds, so there's not a lot of maintenance to come with them. It gives him a lot of peace of mind to be able to kind of manage his properties from a distance. So big shout out to Warren for taking the time to talk to me this week. If you don't already follow him on Instagram or YouTube, make sure you do. I'll put his link to his profiles in the description below. In the next couple of weeks, I will release part 2 of that interview, where we deep dive into rent to rent as a strategy from a landlord's point of view. So make sure you watch out for that content over the next couple of weeks. But until then, make sure you smash the like button. If you haven't subscribed to this channel and Warren's, make sure you do that. And I'll see you again real soon. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.